All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, good to have everyone with us. I want to turn it over to Tonya Wellens, our president and CEO, to just offer us some good morning and introductory remarks. Tonya?
Sure. Thank you, Ronnie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our quarterly book group. I really, like Ronnie said earlier, appreciate the commitment for those of you who show up every quarter, who do the pre-reading and engage in the exchange around the topic and the conversation. We're really, really delighted to have you here with us again this morning. As you all know, the foundation has embarked on a 10-year strategy to advance economic mobility with our agenda around closing the racial wealth gap in the region. Our focus is really on the communities who have been disproportionately impacted over generations, and that is the Black community, the Latinx community, and other immigrant communities especially. And the places we're focused on the populations and the places where they live. So it's both a people agenda and a place agenda. And our vision is we think that our vision is really one where we're pursuing the boldest set of agenda, the boldest agenda that the Community Foundation has actually seen in its 50-year history. It will require us to be more informed about the systemic and root causes that drive inequality in our region. And I am clear that the task and vision before us demands that we expand our imaginations, that we collaborate more deeply, and that we take more courageous actions together. The pieces we have read together, the ideas and concepts that we've been exposed to, the dialogue that we've had with each other is an attempt to move us toward possibility, one where we will all prosper and one where we will all prosper together. And so we are excited to have this conversation today, and we invite you to continue to engage with us in our work ongoing. Again, welcome. We are so delighted to have you join us today. Ronnie.
Thank you, Tonya. We're actually sitting right next to each other. We're over at George Mason University today for a workshop. And Dr. Professor Nembhard, the folks here at GMU told me to give you a shout out. I know you were here last year as their keynote. There was a 2-day workshop on next system studies, how higher education can be a part of the task of raising up the next generation of scholars, activists, practitioners who are working to construct and birth an economy that works for all of us, and to do it in a way that protects the environment, builds community. How do you actually build a course of study, a curriculum, endowed chairs, professors, student movements, and things of the like to do that? And so we're here a part of that workshop, and they gave us this room, this small room, to do this work. So we're side by side. So you might see on your shoulder in my picture here in a second. So, real quick, I just want to rehearse kind of where we've been. Right. Some of you, I'm looking on this call, have been on all of the book talk calls here over the last year. And I'm sure as you're looking at this screen, looking at Isabel Wilkerson's cast, Heather McGee's Some of Us, Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project. In December, we talked with Manuel Pastor from the West Coast on solidarity economics. You can start to see like this through line, right, at the intersection of race and economy, right? And I think what we're signaling here is that this intersection, first of all, is important. And that the solutions as a foundation community, and as a region, that we need to ensure that that all of us are thriving together, that we need to seriously interrogate this intersection of race and economy, and that our solutions need to come from that same intersection. And so I hope that y'all are seeing the through lines, that you're appreciating the themes that are emerging from the conversations that we're having. And between now and the next book group, what I'd like to do is to invite any number of you, anyone who's interested, although I am going to tap some shoulders of folks on this call, to jump in with us on a step back to actually name like, well, what is it that we've been learning and where is this going? Why are we having this conversation and where is it going? But wanted to, again, applaud y'all for being courageous, for being thoughtful, for being present, right? And for taking this journey with us at the Greater Washington Community Foundation to be better informed and to move toward what we hope is an expanded sense of imagination and a willingness to take action at the intersection of race and economy. So thank y'all, and I just wanted to remind of that. So I'm gonna stop sharing screen here in a second because we wanna take a poll. If y'all remember, just about on every call, we wanna check in with y'all to see what you're thinking on some questions. And we use these questions to help guide not just our trajectory as a book group, but also to like inform some of the work that we're doing at the foundation, how we narrate and curate our strategy around the racial wealth gap and economic mobility, and how we move that strategy in a larger public square. So we're gonna ask y'all just some questions to get warmed up, and we're praying everybody keep your fingers crossed that the Zoom technology does what it's supposed to do. So I'm gonna invite my colleague from the foundation, Tiara, to pull up the poll. So the first question, I think there are 5 questions, and some of them are bigger than others, but want to invite y'all into the conversation via the poll. So first question is, how would you rate the health of our democracy on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being not so healthy, 4 being the highest? Very interesting. So it looks like almost, I can't do the math, but 90+%, 91% of the folks on the call are suggesting our democracy is 2 or lower.
Wow.
Lots of anxiety and concern about what's happening in the democracy. And some of our conversation today, we are talking about the economy and an economic model, but it's actually grounded in many ways in the practice and the principles of democracy. So this is a good question and good feedback for us. Tonia's doing the work. Okay, next question, Tiara. How would you rate the health of our economy? Boy, listen, when we formed the question, we didn't know all that was going to be happening over the last couple of weeks. Okay, so it looks like about 70, 71, 2% of the folks would rate 1 or 2, the health of our economy. And about a quarter of the folks gave it a 3, and we had 4% at 4. Again, interesting. So we asked 2 big questions, 2 big systems really that have sway over our life, our economy and our democracy. And there's a sense that both are not as healthy as they should be. So as you are—
Actually, it says that we're in trouble.
We are, like crisis maybe even. Yeah, that's right. So as you're reflecting on your answers, think about some of the sentiment that you're holding for the Q&A that we're gonna have after our author talks. Next question. How concerned are you about the economic future for the younger people in your family and your community? 1's not concerned at all, 4 is very concerned. Okay, again, lots of concern about the economic future of our young people. Next question. Okay, so if you read the book, or the article, or if you're familiar with Professor Nembhard, you know the topic of our conversation today. So this question is about your level of understanding about cooperative enterprises. Oh, okay. Oh, wait a minute. So Professor Nembhard, it gives you an idea of the audience and where they are with their understanding of the cooperative framework. This will be helpful as you're framing your remarks. So lots of opportunity to expose folks to the idea.
Yeah, I don't see the poll. Oh, there. Now I see the poll results. Okay, thanks.
All right, last question. Have you ever been a part of a cooperative?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Thanks, Tiara.
Oh, good. That's not bad.
Lots of exposure. All right, so thank y'all for that. And again, if anything is already starting to come up for you as far as questions or sentiment, even about this kind of questions about democracy and economy, hold those for our Q&A. So I want to move very quickly to the main event for our time together. Family, let me introduce you to Professor Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. She is the author, of course, of the book for our discussion today, Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice from 2014. And she's a 2016 inductee into the U.S. Cooperative Hall of Fame. Professor Nembhard does her work as a professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College, City University of New York. Dr. Gordon-Nembhard is an internationally recognized and widely published political economist. I just want to let you know, Professor Nembhard, when I first heard that phrase, political economy, it liberated me. And I use it a lot of times to make me sound smarter than I really am, but political economy. And if you have a chance, I'd love for you to talk about like, what is that frame, political economy, and why is it important? As a political economist, she specializes in cooperative economics, community economic development, and community-based asset building, including topics and grounded in topics to include racial wealth inequality and solidarity economics and Black political economy, so on and so forth. As we have been reading this book, and I've been talking to folks around the country about our strategy to close the racial wealth gap, different and advance economic mobility, and different interventions that might help in that regard. Professor Nembhard's name and book and writing and thinking and speaking has come up over and over and over again, which tells me that the universe is suggesting to us, Tonya and family, that we are trending in the right direction on this. And not only is Professor Nembhard acclaimed and called on nationally and internationally to talk about her work, but she also is grounded in the reality of the work here in the DC region. And I'd love to invite you, Professor Nembhard, to talk about that. We are grateful for your presence. I just want to also signal that I first met you and your work years ago when my partner, Unique Redwood, was running at the time Consumer Health Foundation, now and they were having their annual meeting, and you were doing a one-on-one fireside chat with her. And I remember my brain and my soul exploding, just affirmed by your worldview and your work. And it happened again as I was reading the book this time. And so we're thrilled to have you with us. As you know, we use this space as an attempt to build family alignment, community around game-changing ideas, some of them that have been with us for a long time, that can help us build community, advance economic mobility, close the racial wealth gap so that we might all thrive together. And so we believe in the possibility, at least I believe, I'm gonna speak for me, I believe in the possibility of your work, and want to turn the mic over to you to lead us in our discussion today. I'm gonna invite you to talk for about 20, 25 minutes. If it gets good and hot, we'll let you go to 25 or 30, and then we'll open up for some dialogue from the community. So Professor Nembhard, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure, especially the work you all are doing. I'm very excited about you taking on the wealth issues. I actually have an edited volume I did 2006, I think, on wealth inequality in communities of color, where we tried to start the dialogue. So I'm glad you guys have taken up the mantle. And yes, I'm a member of Organizing Neighborhood Equity in DC, One DC. We do community organizing, anti-gentrification work, affordable housing. We own our own building, Black Workers and Wellness Center, which is going to be opening on Emancipation Day, April 17th. And we also do, we're hoping to restart our Cooperation DC project and do co-op education, things like that. So again, thanks for doing this work. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you. I just realized, well, I guess you're not going to be looking at me anyway. I don't actually have the light on in my room. But anyway, look at the PowerPoint. You don't need to see me.
Professor Nembhard, you are the light. You are the
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So, yeah, I think I want to talk to you about the lessons learned from the African-American cooperative movement. And obviously, I learned it from the research I did for the book. So let's start. I also, in addition to thanking the organizing, I want to acknowledge our elders, but I also really need to acknowledge, right, that we're on stolen land, and many of us have been stolen people stolen from our lands. So acknowledging the original stewards of the land and inhabitants of North America in particular, since this is where we are. I want to also acknowledge African origins of humanity and all the African descendants that were forcibly brought to this stolen land and enslaved, as well as those of us who continue to labor without just compensation. Acknowledge other indigenous peoples and who have been exploited to enrich colonial and settler powers. Got to acknowledge Mother Earth. Earth Day is coming up again, right? And all this is also about keeping our planet livable and our world sustainable. And then finally, to acknowledge the struggles of our ancestors and the histories of those who have resisted asset stripping, anti-Blackness, patriarchy, labor oppression, and other forms of exploitation. And I really stand on the shoulders of those who use economic cooperation for humanizing and liberating us. And hopefully you'll see from this presentation what I mean by all that. So you saw, I guess you've seen the book, some of you have read it. I kind of summarize it, looking at survival, resistance, and prosperity for African Americans through economic cooperation. Oh, and Ronnie, I did forget to tell you, I do use two last names, Gordon-Nembhard. So I started actually putting the hyphen, even though in my published work, it's still Gordon-Nembhard without the hyphen. And then if you want some information about Latinx co-ops, I did help a colleague of mine, Esther West, in 2020, did a study of current status of Latinx co-ops in the US. So that's how you can get that. And I guess after I finish, I could try to put that URL in the chat if you need me to. So quick, I know, looked like what, about 40% of you do know what a co-op is. So I'll do this part really fast, but Ronnie thought I should go over what a co-op is. So these are enterprises that are member-owned, member-run, member-serving. We use the term member because these are values-based, jointly owned enterprise that operate under the principles of association. Being a member is like the defining part, which is very weird for a business, right? We don't usually think of businesses as having members, but that's what makes co-ops such a unique form of business, right? And then operating under these principles of democratic governance, returns based on economic participation, sustainability, care for community. Co-ops can actually be for-profit as well as not-for-profit. It depends how they're incorporated or what kind they are. Like credit unions are nonprofit financial cooperatives, but most worker co-ops are for-profit businesses. And so I don't go heavily into that difference, but a lot of people don't realize that the model can accomplish either format, right? But the purpose, instead of being profit maximizing, which is what capitalist businesses are about, the purpose is to solve community problems and address access issues. And I'll explain access a little bit more in a minute. What does joint ownership mean? It means we're pooling resources for the common good and leveraging those resources in order to attain sustainability. That way we can reduce individual risks and we can profit share. In co-ops, we usually call it surplus rather than profit, but I don't even know if we're making that distinction that much anymore in the 21st century. Profit kind of has a bad connotation, right? But surplus, right, means you've got resources, especially financial resources, above and beyond what you need to spend on. And so this joint ownership helps us to address low income, capital flight, lack of experience in order to achieve affordable, high quality goods and services, which again is kind of the purpose of having a cooperative business. The types, there's consumer cooperatives. They help consumers to pool their resources to gain access to needed goods and services, usually more in bulk. At affordable prices. There's food co-ops, credit unions, buying clubs, housing co-ops are all consumer co-ops, right? The people who need the service own the co-op and create it and own it. Producer co-ops, people who own the means of production, the land. It's usually land or sometimes it's crafts or whatever. The producers help members to process and market their goods more efficiently, right? So agricultural producer co-ops or marketing co-ops, the farmers, right, get to sell their stuff together or get to market it together, get to distribute it together, get to produce it, right? So dairy farmers would have a co-op to create the milk and the cheese and the butter, like Land of Lakes is a dairy co-op actually. Craft co-ops, the artists, right, would share distribution or share, buy supplies together or market their crafts together, that kind of thing, or find a common space to do their craft work. Worker co-ops, totally owned by the employees of a company, governed democratically to provide better working conditions and pay. And then we have this multi-stakeholder hybrid co-ops, which are sometimes called solidarity co-ops. Those are owned by multi-members, right? Workers and consumers, producers and consumers, workers and producers, workers and community. And those can be a daycare center where the daycare workers and the parents own it. Preschools, the same thing. Restaurants where the servers and the cooks might own it with the customers, things like that. CSA, those are the, I forgot what CSA stands for, but that's where you buy a share to get weekly produce from agricultural workers or from farms, that kind of thing. So sorry, I said I was going to go through that quickly and then I didn't go that quickly. You can ask me some more about it. This is the one I'll go through quickly and we can come back to it if people want to, but what's the difference between a cooperative and an investor stock corporation? The biggest issue is this one member, one vote. In a stock corporation, it's one share, one vote. So the people who have the most money and who own the most shares get to make all the decisions, and the profit maximization is the purpose. And in a co-op, it's only one member, one vote. No matter how much you've invested or put into the co-op, everybody gets one vote. That's the democracy. And then the purpose is satisfying a need, problem solving, not creating profits. The more I started to study cooperatives, especially as a solution to Black community economic development, I realized that A lot of people think co-ops are a European thing, and it was brought by white people to the United States. And while the Europeans were the first ones to kind of codify the principles and practices of cooperatives and started an international cooperative association in the 1800s, right? They're not the only groups that have used cooperation, solidarity, and mutual aid. And so I do like to point out that, right, mutual aid, economic cooperation, solidarity economics have been used by every population in human history, in every era of human history, on every continent. Actually, I forgot to put it on this slide, but I now talk about cooperative economics as our very first economic system. So I've tried to stop talking about it as an alternative system. It's actually, we're returning to our roots, to our the first way that human beings started to practice economics was through cooperation. And so those notions we hear, the common good, commonwealth, the commons, right, all come from those early notions that we're all on this planet together, we're all surviving together, and that survival depends on us working together. So collectivism, mutual aid, there's also revolving loan funds, rotating savings and credit. Sometimes they're called SUSUs. Different groups call them different things. But again, this pooling of resources to help the group, and the group making the decisions about what happens to those resources are practiced throughout the world in all different forms. We have the notion of collective work and responsibility from the Kwanzaa principles. And we know that First Nations, as well as early African civilizations, as I said, all of us started out using cooperation, economic cooperation. And it's really just because of mercantilism and then capitalism that, kind of subsumed and overrode and alienated us from that sense of economic solidarity. And so getting back to our roots, our solidarity, our cooperative roots, are the things that I try to argue about. And that's what I was looking for in Collective Courage. I wanted to understand what was happening in Black American communities and what our relationship was to economic cooperation and owning of co-op businesses. And what I found was hundreds of mutual aid societies, Black communal towns, and formal as well as informal economic cooperation, at least from 1780s to 2013, which is just before I published the book. There's a lot more happening now, and I'll talk about that briefly later. I think there was probably economic cooperation even before 1780, but that's sort of when the first official mutual aid society is recorded. But if you think about it, there was economic cooperation in the Underground Railroad, right? People were sharing resources to move people from enslavement to freedom, and all kinds of other sharing, even on the slave ships as we were kidnapped from our African continent and brought here. There were ways that we were cooperating to revolt, cooperating to survive, etc. In terms of actually incorporated cooperative enterprises, I mention about 162 of them in my book, which to some people may seem like a lot, since most people told me that Black folks didn't own cooperatives. But it might sound like a little when you think about, over 200 or 300 years. But a lot of the problem is lack of documentation. So the 162 were ones that I found any information on. And that doesn't include the 20 credit unions and 154 co-ops that Du Bois found in 1907. So this was, I didn't mention everything that he mentioned in his book. I looked at a couple of the ones he looked at, and then I tried to find additional stuff and to expand on the work he did in 1907. And the other thing is there are rural and urban co-ops, North and South, Midwest and West. So people always ask me, where were they more prominent? And we think of them more prominent in the South of the US, but that's not true. There's no one industry that they were in. There's farm co-ops, mills, artist co-ops, housing co-ops, credit unions, all kinds. So there's no one industry, and there's no one area of the country. So that's the overview. So obviously, I think it's obvious from what you've heard me say already, and from for those of you, whatever you read about the topic, right? We now know that African Americans have a long and strong history of mutual aid and cooperative ownership. Often this was in reaction to the market failures of capitalism, as well as economic racial discrimination. So I often talk about that we started using co-ops for survival, right? But that there's also, once we realized how well the cooperative model worked for us, we also started to use co-ops to do more than just survive and to actually position us to have some economic independence and even some economic liberation toward full racial justice. So it's an interesting trajectory also to see where and when some of these co-ops were really just so we could put some food on the table and not be malnourished, and then where they were really positioning us to control our own communities and have more control over what we did politically and economically. It was a hidden history, so it took me about almost 15 years to publish the book, because I kept thinking I needed to find more information, more details about each of the co-ops I'd found, and it's really hard. There's very little documentation. I had to piece together information from different sources when I could, and sometimes it was just one source. Sometimes I didn't even know the whole history of a co-op. I just knew when it disbanded or when it started. But this hidden history also is complicated because, right, Black folks and Black businesses are so economically marginalized. They don't always show up on the books. There's not always things written about them, but also a lot of the efforts and a lot of the co-ops were sabotaged and thwarted by racial discrimination and white supremacist violence. So there's examples of white supremacist terrorism actually burning down a co-op, lynching some of the prominent members, as well as, white banks colluding not to loan to a co-op, trains and trucks colluding not to move the co-op's produce or product across the country, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of issues, both with documentation and with actual sabotage. And we can talk about that more if you want. The other thing that's important to say that I learned is that the Black co-op movement and the use of solidarity and cooperative economics really parallels what we call the long civil rights movement. So all the efforts of African Americans to resist enslavement, oppression, fighting for our own freedom, along with the political and legal struggles, we have always practiced these quote unquote economic alternatives, right? And many of the players in the Black co-op movement turn out to be ones who were famous in the civil rights movement, like Ella Jo Baker, A. Philip Randolph, and pretty much in the 20th century, almost any Black civil rights leader that you can mention to me, I can tell you something that they had to do with a co-op, a credit union, a group that was promoting co-ops, that kind of thing. And we also know that some of the largest, strongest Black organizations throughout our history actually promoted co-op education. Not all of them do you know about, like the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, I'm sure you've never heard of, from the 1880s, but you do know about the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Garvey movement. They toyed with co-ops. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters promoted co-ops, the Nation of Islam, SNCC, Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Black Panther Party, the Movement for Black Lives, have all incorporated issues about economic justice and collective ownership in their movements, because they realize that we can't really achieve racial justice, civil rights, even without economic justice and economic democracy. Here's just some lists. Sorry, I'm going kind of quickly, but I want to get to a few examples. Here's a list of some of the organizations through history, starting with the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union. Our very first, and that group was both a political party, part of the Black populist movement, but it was also a labor union and a co-op developer, and it had the unique membership of farmers, so landowners and farm workers, who usually we think of as being as clashing, but Black landowners and Black farmers and Black laborers were in this organization together. The Ex-Slave Pension Society, started by a Black woman, was actually our first reparations movement, first organization of reparations movement, but it was also a mutual aid society. As I said, the UNIA flirted with co-ops. There was the Negro Cooperative Guild, very short-lived. Colored Merchants Association was a co-op of individual Black grocers trying to stay in business after the white chain grocery stores started. The National Association of Colored Farmers was similar to the CFNAC. Young Negroes Cooperative League, I will talk a little bit more about. Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, I said already. By the 60s and 70s, we had the Poor People's Corporation, the Black Panther Party, all practicing and starting cooperatives. Federation of Southern Cooperatives started during that time and still exists as a regional co-op development organization. Nation of Islam started some co-ops throughout starting in the 1980s, and currently we still have groups, Green Worker Cooperatives in the South Bronx, Cooperation Jackson. I could have put Cooperation DC, though we're not doing a lot right now, and other groups. So what is this whole movement created, right? It allowed Blacks to pool resources, to provide those quality goods and services and access to them that we needed, especially culturally and geographically sensitive goods and services. It helped us to save costs, which then increased our incomes and our wealth. Also, right, this joint ownership of a business is a kind of wealth. So we both helped increase income, but also wealth and asset ownership. It was a way to combat racial discrimination, almost to separate ourselves from the discriminatory systems that we were in. It increased our economic stability, self-sufficiency, group independence, self-determination. It saved or created decent jobs in communities. It helped us to develop collective agency and action and develop leadership. And these, some of these are economic, but some of these are what we call non-market, right, benefits. So that's the other reason why, cooperatives are kind of a social economic strategy, both addressing social issues, political issues, but also the economic issues. Lessons learned, the importance of education and study groups. So you guys are right in this mix, right? In fact, most of the co-ops that I learned anything about how they started with a study group, people coming together saying we have a problem, we need to study it, and then realizing they like the co-op model and studying the co-op model together, right? The significance of organizational supports. I already said that so many of the major Black organizations, even though we don't know about them because of their co-op organizing and co-op education programs, so many of them were involved in co-op education or supporting co-ops in some way. The significance of community involvement and sense of solidarity. So that many of the co-ops survived and even survived the white supremacist terrorism because their communities supported them. Communities understood what they were doing, supported them by being customers, supported them by giving them donations, or sometimes supported them physically, stood in front of the co-op with their guns and protected the co-op. So we mean community involvement and support on the whole range of what that means. The pooling of resources and the access to non-exploitative resources, right, was really important. So finding our own resources so we didn't, again, have to depend on other people or depend on what other people told us we were supposed to be doing. And then the democratic participation, sharing of power, right? So this governance structure, which is so essential to the co-op model, also was essential to how African Americans were able to use and benefit from co-ops, and understanding that making joint decisions about economics and making decisions together, in addition to pooling the resources, made a big difference. And then another actually surprising thing for me was the role of Black women and the way that Black women led so many of these co-ops, so many of the co-op movements, and even some of the major co-op organizations. And finally, the participation of youth. It turned out bringing Black youth together to talk about and to start co-ops has been really important to the movement, both for its continuity, but also as a way to ground it and to get some adults interested. If their children are doing it, then they get more interested. So those are some of the major lessons. I'll give you some examples of co-ops based on those lessons. I already talked about why community and organization matter, so I'll pass that one for now. The three most prolific periods of African-American co-op ownership that I found were the 1880s, 1930s and 40s, and the 1960s and 70s. So why those three periods? These are my suggestions. I think one, survival needs, especially the 1880s and the 1930s. Those are both periods of economic recession. And co-ops really helped to put food on the table, to get some access to credit, things like that, when there was no other options, right? But also some of these periods were active race conscious periods and racial transformation, civil rights, Black power movements. Again, the 1880s was a period for that. And if you want to ask me more about the 1880s, it was a fascinating period for labor unions and co-ops and Black progressives. And then the 1960s, right, and 70s was Black power, race consciousness. So that seemed to make a difference. The need for economic independence in order to be politically active, right? Again, the 1880s and the 1960s have that in common. And then Black organizations focusing on economic liberation and deliberate co-op development, all three periods. I've also started to talk about, I think the 2020s are going to be our fourth period of most prolific activity, because I'm seeing lots and lots of interest in and startups for co-ops of all kinds, especially food co-ops and worker co-ops, and mutual aid societies, especially since the pandemic. So the 1880s was also really interesting. And as I said, you can ask me more about it, because labor unions were starting then, advocating for worker control. That included for them developing co-ops and worker co-ops, as well as other co-ops to support worker control and labor. So a lot of the labor unions were also doing co-op development and co-op activity. They were all connected to the populist movement, which was arguing for the political rights for Black and white small farmers and laborers. And so populist political parties were also, labor unions were also co-op developers, like the Knights of Labor, Colored Farmers, National Alliance and Cooperative Union, et cetera. So a really fascinating time at the height of the backlash against Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacist terrorism and the Ku Klux Klan and that kind of stuff. This progressive, community-owned but national organizations promoting it was a really important period. I said that we know that Black co-ops are often begun by educational and religious institutions, started with the study group. So education matters. The Young Negroes Cooperative League, now I'm getting into my examples, started during the Great Depression in 1930. And its mission was to bring the co-op structure, to bring cooperative economics to young Black folks. And the notion was that capitalism had failed us, that they considered the middle-class Blacks and the older Blacks to be entrenched in capitalism, and that wasn't going to save the race. But if young people started learning and started co-ops, that would be what would help us. That would be what would save us. Ella Jo Baker co-founded it with a guy named George Schuyler. And Ella was the executive director for the 5 years of its existence. They had about 25 to 30 delegates from different states who started different chapters. And they wanted to make sure to keep control of the organization in the hands of young people, to bring women on equal basis with men, and to provide co-op education and develop co-ops. They had a long 5-year plan, which they didn't actually achieve, but I think it's an important plan for us to think of now, right? So it's a plan about starting small, a forum in each community where there are 5 or more members. So every time you had a delegate, if they could get a little chapter together, start a forum, that forum would start some kind of co-op enterprise, a buying club, a a credit union, a grocery store, a housing co-op, anything like that, right? Start whole, and then build up, make sure there was a credit union in each community where there was a council, have a wholesale establishment in each state, and then have regional factories, all cooperative, right? Building up to the national group that would kind of help hold everyone together and do the training and that kind of thing. So a really nice model, which I think we can use today for how to, build small, but end up with a national movement and a national support.
Prof, can I jump in? If you could take about 5 more minutes,
Yep.
we can get the questions. Okay.
Yep. So I'll skip Gary and Deanna. You can ask me about it, but that's one of the greatest examples of starting with a study group, again, during the Great Depression. And they created Consumers Cooperative Trading Company that lasted throughout. I'll talk, since we're in DC, one of my last examples will be Cooperative Industries of DC, chartered in 1936 as what they called then a self-help cooperative, and it was in Lincoln Heights. They started out as a producer co-op or a worker co-op with unemployed, unskilled workers and homemakers, especially women. They did sewing, canning, broom making. Nanny Helen Burroughs, who you all might know of, in addition to starting the School for Women and Girls, National School for Women and Girls, also was a co-founder of Cooperative Industries of DC. She realized that especially domestic workers needed better employment that they could control, that paid better, that didn't exploit them so much. And so she got excited about the co-op model and helped to find this cooperative. For 3 years, she tried to get federal grant money, finally got it in the 3rd year, and they used that to buy a farm in Maryland. And then they actually became one of our first hybrid worker consumer co-ops. So they kind of, in some ways, piloted the multi-stakeholder model that we're now using without calling it that. But they did farm to city kind of stuff with the farm, and then they still did their sewing, canning, and broom making. Jackson, Mississippi in the 60s, right, were able to create 13 producer cooperatives, a marketing co-op, and sewing, leather working, candles. They had over 800 members, mostly with former sharecroppers. So this was a way to get better work for former sharecroppers. Freedom Quilting Bee in Alabama was similar. They had women sharecroppers doing quilting and making a living from that. The Black Panther Party, if people don't realize it, was really doing community development as much as it was doing self-defense and anti-police brutality, trying to create the kinds of programs, societies, organizations that would mirror the life of liberation that they were trying to achieve. And so they organized co-ops and collectives in addition to their free breakfast programs and their health clinics. Fast forward even more, we have our largest worker-owned company in the United States, started in 1987 in the South Bronx, Cooperative Home Care Associates. It's mostly Latina and African-American women members. They also started a nonprofit training subsidiary back to how important education is, so they could make sure all their members had high quality, state-of-the-art training. They actually lead their industry in above average wages in home care, benefits. They have career ladder supports. They train their members in all the levels of nursing. You can also get trained and experienced to become part of the management of the company. And so they're a real model for how to make an unskilled, low-skilled, predominantly women of color industry, right, very feasible and relatively profitable. And if you're worrying about, wealth, Cooperative Home Care has a very strong asset building component as well between their retirement plans, their banking of their members. They also have IDA accounts for their members, individual development accounts to do match savings and some other things. And they give back great dividends. About 25% of your initial equity gets paid back every year that the co-op is profitable, which has been 90% of their years. And then we'll end with getting control of the digital platforms, right? Platform cooperatives, and this is the Drivers Co-op in New York City. It's a ride-hailing cooperative to rival Uber and Lyft, right? Both to get better pay, but also they're trying to figure out how to transition the industry to a more green industry, but also more benefits to the members as well as to the drivers. The drivers actually make more money, but they're also own part of the company, right? So profits go back to the drivers in addition to the better pay. And because they're a co-op, they do democratic decision-making, and it's easier for the riders. Also, they get riders who want to be in solidarity with a drivers co-op. So you can ask me about Black youth co-ops. That was the thing I was going to end on. And sorry, I went over time, but there's so much I could talk about. Thanks for listening, and I'm excited about the Q&A.
Can we give Professor Gordon-Nembhard a round of applause and some inviting faces? Renee Licht, who's been taking this walk with us, she just signaled she has to jump off, but I just want to express her sentiment. Professor Nembhard, thank you for this research. And just like those of us who are interested in this topic talk about Du Bois's work and him, doing his work to try to document and add fuel to this movement, 100 years from now, I am confident people are going to be talking about your work. And hopefully not just your work, but our work as a community. Hopefully that we find the will to take up these ideas. So thank you. And thank you, Renee, for expressing that sentiment. All right. Of course, I always come to these conversations. Thank you. No, thank you. I come to these conversations with 1,000 questions, and I have them all right here to kind of get us going. But I'm gonna hold those and just open the space up, drawing on the wisdom and the spirit of the group. What questions, reactions do you have either for Professor Nembhard or for the room, right? So this is a conversation not just with our author, but also for each other. And I see there's a hand up already. Reverend Warner, and as you talk, introduce yourself. Don't give us the 5 minute on your organization. That isn't for you, Reverend Warner. That's for everybody, although you are a preacher, so I know how you preachers are. Just tell us who you are, if you have an organizational affiliation, and then make your comment or question. Reverend Warner.
Such slander so early in the morning. My name is Tim Warner. I pastor Emory Grove United Methodist Church in Gaithersburg, Maryland. I'm a community builder, pastor. Also do some work for Habitat for Humanity because they've got the only home ownership housing justice model that actually provides reparation for people, right? But anyway, thank you, Dr. Gordon-Nembhard, for your presentation. Sparked so many things in my heart relevant to the work we're doing right now. We are in the midst at our church in literally rebuilding the community around our church. We have an opportunity to put up 450 units of housing in a community that was raised by urban renewal in the late 60s and 70s that was, while poor, very functional. And among the things that it had, in addition to an entertainment facility and a large camp meeting site and a market, was a lodge where the Black people there traded and provided mutual support economically for one another because they could not bank during those times. I'm wondering, my heart is searching for a model that recreates a community that brings that ethic, right? So people are taking care of each other. And I think co-ops may be the way to do it. I also recognize, though, that we're going to need to build capacity to get to the point, right? Because the community is no longer as united as it was. There are different people in the community. And I'm wondering how we can build capacity through organizing, through training, and then through development of some co-ops to provide a local economy that is self-supporting in that place. I think it's a great model, but how to get there, I think, is the big question that I have, and the support to get there. So I wonder if you could make some comments that would be helpful there.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for asking the question. I'm sorry I had to turn off my camera because for some reason my internet is unstable. I don't know what happened. Hopefully you can still hear me at least.
I can.
Great. So actually there's lots of questions in your question, but let me say the first thing is, right, the first lesson of community organizing is you start where people are, right? And as I said, one of the things I learned from this history of African-American cooperatives is that starting where people are meant study groups, right? Getting people together to talk about stuff. So even if you don't start talking about starting a co-op, you start talking about what are the issues we're facing, what are the problems we need to solve, and then you can bring in co-ops as one way to solve some of these problems. And definitely a housing co-op, right? Either a limited equity housing co-op or a regular market-based housing co-op. DC is probably the city with the second or third most housing co-ops in the country. New York City leads, but DC has the second or third most. My organization, One DC, that's actually one of our specialties, is helping tenants to organize themselves into a co-op. There's not as much, there used to be a pot of money to help do that. There's not so much a pot of money anymore, but but that could be another part of the strategy. But right now, getting people together to talk about stuff, right? And then telling these stories, right? You could tell some of the stories about some of the co-ops in DC. Another book you might want to read is Amanda Huron. Oh God, I just forgot the name of her book, but she did her book is all about the housing co-ops in DC and how the housing co-op movement actually started with Black women in DC needing a place to live. And she talks about housing co-ops as being the new urban commons, right? And the way for us to own things collectively in an affordable way. So she, even if you don't have her come looking at her book, I think she's also got a couple articles out about it. So just learning, right, why and how people have used housing co-ops, and then getting people in who can tell you how to start them and that kind of thing, I think could help. I think the other thing, I'm definitely a believer about starting small. And I know a lot of people, and especially in my field in economics, believe in economies of scale and let's do big stuff. And I don't think the big stuff is worth it unless it's bubbled up from the bottom up, right? Because the big stuff is just imposing things from the top. People don't really understand why or whatever. They're just doing it. They're following the bureaucracy or they're following a model blindly. But if you do it from the bottom up, you've got people who have actually thought together, learned together, who understand the processes, right? And then help to create the larger policies or contribute to the larger coalitions and stuff that give us scale, right? So instead of trying to do scale from the top down, building scale because we have more and more of us doing this, more and more of us in coalition with other people who are doing it, and more interlocking systems and federations of smaller co-ops and stuff. So I think just getting people to talk together, see what other people are doing, learn from what other people have done, and then connecting with other people who are doing similar work, to me, is how we would make this strong. So starting with those working together, political education, finding the places where you have people who have the expertise who are willing to come and talk. And as I said, I really also believe in youth co-ops, right? Helping young people start a co-op that gets them understanding it. It also gets their families involved and wanting to understand it better. And the final thing I'll say is I used to talk about a model where if you just start with any kind of community project, and I was using building a playground as an example, because there was an organization that helps communities to build their own playground. But any activity like that, again, gets people working together, recognizing what skills each person has. Sometimes it involves, grassroots fundraising, so people realize how they can start to pool resources and get some small amounts of money, and you have a tangible, right? It's usually within 6 months or a year that you can get these playgrounds going. It's a tangible outcome that people can see. We did this together, and then they can see the strengths of pooling their resources and working together and making decisions about it, and then they can move on to something bigger. So even if there's some small little project, something to help young people or something to get young people involved, people can see how it works, can start to understand their place in it, and then you could move on to a bigger project. Oh, and the final thing, I'm sorry, is how important religious institutions have been in the Black co-op movement. A lot of the early co-ops, a lot of the early study groups, a lot of the early sites for co-op startups were in churches and Black independent schools. So the movement, right, the fact that, and a lot of credit unions, Black credit unions started with church groups and church congregations. So there's a strong history there. I've written about it in other places. And so you already have that base. You have people who know each other, care about each other. And so, just helping them to focus on how, what's the kinds of collective things they could be doing to make small changes that could lead to big changes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Warner, for the question, for the response. We had a couple of folks who had to jump off. Reverend Lamar. Good.
Sir, I'm still here, and I'd love to get in the queue for a question, but let me know.
No, go ahead. I know you gotta jump in a little bit. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Doc, when you mentioned religious institutions being at the fountain, I think often about the AME Church. I think about Reverend E. Ransom, who was a socialist, talked about co-ops. And, we've got some great space right in the heart of the city, blocks from the White House. And I love the model, and I want to read more about it. What do you have any suggestions? I mean, we're in the same city. What do you think folks like me can do to begin to help to move and expand this?
Right. So the first thing is to try to figure out what's a need that the co-op could solve, right? I see you put in the chat something about a restaurant, right? There's great models for co-op community-owned restaurants, right? There's a model in Austin, Texas, where it's actually a multi-stakeholder co-op. So the servers, it's also a brewery, so the brewmasters, the chefs, the servers, all own the co-op collectively with the community. But the workers also have their own self-managed collective to manage the restaurant. In addition to owning the restaurant collectively with community. And one reason why they have community owning it is, one, for the stability in the community, but also for extra, everybody who owns it has to put in some equity. So it gives them non-extractive finance to help with the business. In addition to letting the community feel like they have a say in what happens at the restaurant, what kind of restaurant it is, but then the workers self-manage themselves, so they can at least have the control over the day-to-day supervision of their work life. So, there's lots of options. The first thing is to try to figure out what the need is, and then bringing people together to start to talk about all these different options and to think through what might work best in your situation. You could do the same thing. There was a collectively owned laundromat once in Columbia Heights for a while in the 90s, I think that was. So again, people came together. That was actually members of a church choir who came together because they all lived in the same neighborhood and realized there was no good laundromat. So again, what's the need? Then bring people together who have that common need or who want to help solve that need, and then look at all the different kinds of, right? Co-ops are very flexible in terms of the different kinds of ownership structures. So that's where, again, the studying, right? It could be a multi-stakeholder co-op, it could be a worker co-op, it could be a consumer co-op, right? You need to study to figure out which model will work for you. Also getting your congregation to start to study what has already happened in your church's history or in their neighborhood also is another way to help get people together to think about what the legacies already are and what they could work on, that kind of thing.
Thank you so much.
Nice, nice. I think we have another hand up from Xavier.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I definitely I appreciate you making the time for you all to hosting this meeting. My question was, so I helped to co-found a worker-owned food cooperative called Southeast DC, and we read your book and we read Freedom Farms that talked about Fannie Hamer Hurt Cooperative, and we were connected to some people from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and stuff like that, and we're able to learn a lot about farming cooperatives. So we want to kind of try to do our own thing up here in DC around food. And our biggest thing was trying to figure out, as a worker-owned cooperative, we're still interacting with the same market forces that other businesses kind of go through. And they're kind of definitely rough in DC. And so we were trying to figure out ways that cooperatives and worker-owned cooperatives specifically can raise capital so that we can expand the work that we're doing. And we're primarily focused in Ward 7 and Ward 8. So if there was any ideas on non-extractive funding for worker-owned cooperatives or ways that we can kind of try to raise capital that kind of will fit our the values that we're trying to go to.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually a couple of different strategies that I've seen used. The first one is what's called non-voting shares, where you actually get investment from people, but they do it as a social long-term investment, not as, trying to extract dividends out of you. And so they can't vote, right? So your voting is still under your own control. And they accept a very low interest rate and a long-term payment. Sometimes they're willing to let the loan turn into a grant, depending on who you're getting the loans from. And that way, a group called Equal Exchange, that's a worker co-op that does fair trade products. They kind of pioneered that model. So they were able to raise money from progressive groups that were willing, as I said, to either not get much interest or get very small interest and to be paid back over a long period of time. So they're really just supporting the co-op, not expecting much back. So that's one thing. I've also seen co-ops that have done fundraisers in their community, just again, amassing small grassroots donations. I don't know how much money you need, but having a block party, right, and charging for the block party, or having a movie night and charging for that. So again, that's small amounts of money, but it also lets your community know who you are, what you're about, and has, again, them feeling like they're connected to you or helping you. That model I just mentioned, Black Star Restaurant in Austin, right, they actually have community ownership, but the community ownership is limited, so the workers still self-manage the day-to-day activities, but they do get equity from their community owners. So there's that. And then there's beginning to be now a pool of co-op lenders who are also doing, again, low interest rates or non-extractive lending. So the first one that comes to my mind is Seed Commons, which actually does non-extractive lending. You only pay back, and it's a modest interest rate or fees if you can afford to pay it back. If you can, it actually turns into a loan, but but that's a relationship between you and the funder about how and when it turns into a loan. But they have local co-op loan funds throughout the US, and then they have a national steering committee and the funder who actually brings in a lot of the money that the locals get to use to fund out. We're starting one here in DC that Beloved Communities is running at the moment. Also, Bread in Baltimore has one that often lends to DC. And so you have that option. There's a group called Shared Capital out of Minneapolis that also does preferred lending to co-ops. And there's a Co-op Fund of New England that has now started doing national funding as well. So there are these non-extractive funds that are also out there. So I would look into all those options. And again, depending on who you guys are, what kinds of community organizing you do and can do, you might use all of those strategies, or one might work better for you than others.
Thank you.
Wow, what a wealth of information there, Xavier. Hopefully that was helpful. I was certainly taking notes. And Michael Rubin, I know you over at Impact Silver Spring, as y'all are trying to crank up. This is the same question you've been posing to us as a philanthropic organization. And so I'm taking notes. I know that you are too. I see another hand up. Is it Evelyn?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. Our organization has helped in the past to create 2 co-op. One is a housing co-op of 280 units. The other one is a taxi driving co-op of 275 drivers in Alexandria, Virginia. So we know that the co-op style model is one of the best to really support the families that we work with, to control their wealth, to increase their economic status, stability in general, right?
Yeah.
It creates a lot of great opportunities. But now that we're trying to move south from Alexandria to Fairfax County, and we're looking at the mobile homes community, and we are looking at the threats that the communities are going through. Outside, big corporations are coming in and buying those communities. Those communities are being organized by us, and they would like to become like a housing mobile home community cooperative. Yeah. But what we see, especially on the government, is that they're not willing to take that step. Like, they are not scared, but they always talk bad about co-op models. And I do understand why is that, right? Because it's a way to free people. It's a way for people to, create wealth, and they want to control our families. So I wonder if you have any suggestions on how we can start changing the conversation with the local government, that they're investing the money in so many ways when they talk about deep affordable housing, which sometimes is the wrong way, the way that they're doing it. It's not really getting to the family that need it the most. It's not really stabilizing housing. If you have any suggestion on how we can approach and start changing that dynamic, that would be great. And the other question that I have, and I don't know if you have answered to this one, it's why nonprofits developers are not really seeking opportunity to create co-ops. Because we have the same issue in Alexandria. We're trying to push the developers to create co-op because they're getting a lot of funding through the city, through the state, through the federal, but they're not focusing on co-ops models. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. And thank you. And I'm sorry that I take so much time with you.
No, that's okay. Those are great questions. And thank you for all you and your organization do. I mean, I've heard a lot about what you guys are doing in Alexandria. It's very impressive. First, a question. When you said for the mobile homes, the manufactured homes, is it the owners of the manufactured homes, or you're saying the city officials who are distrustful of co-op?
Is the community, the families are on of the mobile home, but there is a private owner of the land. So they rent basically the parking space.
Right.
Parking.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is, a movement for mobile home co-ops. I don't remember the name of the organization, but they have all kinds of great materials and experiences with how to convert mobile home, or they think they call them manufacturing home co-ops. So I think it started in New Hampshire. I know of a group in Asheville, North Carolina, that have been doing really great models of how to convert trailer parks to manufacturing home co-op, manufactured home co-ops, and they have, I think, a toolkit. So I do need to figure out, I'll try to remember the name, but maybe somebody can search it on the web. So they have good ideas for how to do it. And I think it includes trying to get control of the land. It's similar to the tenant organizing, again, that my 1DC and others have done, right? We first organize the tenants, then we figure out how to get them to buy the property from the owner, or, if the owner is sighted enough, we can get the city to turn the property over to them. So there, so you can look at how housing co-ops have figured out how to convert, and you can look at these new toolkits for doing manufacturing. But in general, again, and this goes to your question about developers too, and I was thinking you were saying city officials. One of the things some of us have been doing is actually talking to developers and city officials about why this model. Now, definitely they don't want to do it because it doesn't bring as much profit, right? Real estate is hugely profitable. So you've got to figure out how to kind of get their altruistic side, right? And show, right, for the city officials, you can show how much better it is, right? The housing co-ops are more stable, people are homeowners, right? We were able to convince New York City to put money into converting businesses and starting worker co-ops because we showed them that it's a model that addresses unemployment and poverty. So you could, give arguments about poverty and stability and how these co-op models protect that. And then with the developers, sometimes you can get a progressive developer who's willing to be part of it. They still want their cut, but they're willing to take a much smaller cut. But most of the time, I think you're going to have to argue with the people around them to force them to support the co-op development, because the city officials, the residents, right? If they can be pressuring the developers, right? This is the kind of model we want. It's much more stable and supportive of community. It's right. You can also connect with the community land trust movement, right? I've seen models where you first get a community land trust established, and that again, often you can get the land through the city government. But once you have a community land trust, you could put manufactured housing or the trailers on the community land trust and have an MOU with the community land trust, so that the co-op trailer owners would have an arrangement with the land trust, so the rent wouldn't go up or there would be no rent or whatever. Or the manufactured owners could actually own the land trust and then have the co-op on top of the land trust that they created. So there are a lot of different kinds of strategies for how to take land out of speculation and then how to start, right, a housing co-op of whatever kind it is. And we've got some places that also have used the strategy of trying to talk to city officials, trying to talk to elected officials, trying to talk to developers to show them why it's in everybody's better interest. And that's where you need to do a little bit of cost benefit analysis and things like that. And we can try to connect you to groups that have had some success with that in other places.
Outstanding. And what a wonderful question. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And there are a number of folks on this call and the networks that are practitioners, technical support providers, and there are also some philanthropic partners. See Han Lee, president, CEO, co-president, CEO of IF, of course, Greater Washington, policy folks, DC Fiscal Policy Institute. So we got a lot. I think what I hear you saying, Professor Gordon-Nembhard, is that there's some movement building and organizing that needs to happen to advance these ideas at the level of not just imagination and practice, but also policy.
Right, and that we have some examples of places that have been able to do some of that movement building. So we know it's possible. And so it's a matter, right, of organizing ourselves, right? So it's all the stuff you're already doing, right? Putting the information together, putting out the stories and the examples, and then, right, having the conversations, and then doing the organizing and coalition building and getting it out there. You could also do showcases, right? Either local or bring in national people from national to show people, right, how this is possible, to hear some of the other stories, because that's a big thing now in our movement, telling the stories, right, makes a huge difference.
And I also want to acknowledge our colleague, Jordan Carter from Horning Family Foundation, who's on the call too. We know they sitting on a gold mine over there. So just messing with you, Jordan. So we're about at time. And Dr. Gordon-Nembhard, I'm going to ask a big question. I'm going to invite you to answer in 2 minutes. Okay, I'll give you 3. So at the foundation, we are pursuing, you talked about cooperative economics in Black communities and many communities responding to a problem, right? And so there are many, many kind of challenges and gaps, but the problem as we have defined it, by the way, it's problem and the solution is around these issues of economic mobility for Black and Latinx folks and closing the racial wealth gap, right? So that's the problem. And our thinking is that if we can close those gaps, we actually can help to like create progress on a whole bunch of fronts. What do you think about the kind of theory of change that we have, that if our communities, Black and Latinx communities, could be more engaged in a liberated way in cooperative economics, we could actually see them advance their economic mobility and close the racial wealth gap. So can cooperative economics help us close those gaps and produce more economic mobility and wealth with communities of color?
Oh, yes, of course. How about that? A quick answer.
Okay.
I guess you want to sort of know how. So I've argued in a couple other places. I didn't talk about it as much in the book because I started thinking about it more after I published the book. But I've been toying with this notion of community wealth and collective assets, right? And instead of us, to me, closing the wealth gap, a lot of people think about, okay, we just need more wealthy people of color, right? And then the wealth gap in terms of the numbers, the size of it, right, will close. But I'm actually more interested in ending poverty. So I'm focused on, we all need to be prosperous in some ways. It's harder under a capitalist system, but I think it's even possible, even if we don't get rid of capitalism, because if we can have these cooperative enclaves, right? Co-ops are viable businesses that have assets. And we know one of the pieces of a wealth portfolio, especially the most wealthy people, is their business equity and their business access, right? A lot of the closing the wealth gap, people are interested in getting people into home ownership, which is important, right? Mostly for stability, but home ownership isn't actually the way that most people have wealth or own wealth, right? So my idea is if we owned enterprises collectively, in addition to having co-op housing and things like that, that's where that business equity, like Cooperative Home Care Associates, it's our largest worker co-op, and most years, right? It used to be, I'm not sure if their equity share went up, but it used to be that you had to pay $1,000 to be a member, but you could pay it off in installments out of your paycheck. So you didn't have to come into the co-op with the $1,000. You came into the co-op, got trained, worked in the co-op, and then it came out like union dues. It came out of your pay, and you eventually paid your $1,000. But that company has been able to pay about 25% dividends every year. So in 4 years, you've gotten your $1,000 back, but you're still a member. You still have co-ownership of all the assets, and you still keep getting dividends every year. That's wealth, right? And that's stable wealth because it's also your job. You've got a retirement plan. You've got a say in what's happening at your job. You have a say in how much gets distributed. But that's real business equity, right? But it's owned collectively in addition to getting people their individual dividends. So I think if we think about those kinds of models, even if we can't change the whole system, we can have that level of ownership, which at least, because when you look at, right, wealth, Latinx and Black wealth, right, at our best, we have about $17,000 in wealth. So if we have a business, that's giving us, $1,000, $5,000 in our own equity, and then joint equity of millions, that goes a long way to getting us out of poverty and getting us at least closer to the median wealth of the group, right? For people who have no wealth or negative wealth. So that's what I think of. And we could talk about it a lot more another time, but that's kind of the idea I have. And this is also self-determination, right? We're controlling the wealth that we're building. We're not owning somebody else's stock in somebody else's company where they're making all the decisions and exploiting other people and polluting our earth and that kind of stuff. Sorry, I went over my 3 minutes. I apologize.
No, that's fine. That's fine. And I just needed for you to say that on tape for this whole crew, because we're going to be sharing this with our trustees and our wider community. Listen, just want to say thank you again for sharing so richly and so clearly with us. Lots of head nods, lots, I can tell, inviting faces. And we're looking forward to being in deeper relationship with you as we continue to incite and grow this movement in the city and in the region. So if we could, again, give Professor Nembhard a round of applause and give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've brought to the space. Just real quick, we're going to be convening again in June, I think on the 23rd, TR, for our next book group. I have a recommendation that we read Rob Hopkins' book, From What Is to What If. From What Is to What If. It's about imagination. And so we've been going hard at this intersection of race and economy and things that are like. This book really is about opening our imagination for the future to do this movement building work and this modeling that Professor Nembhard is talking about. So that's what I'm proposing now, but I'm also having Afrofuturism is tingling in my spirit, Jordan. And so don't be surprised if like first the next week maybe we get a shift in the dynamic before then. Later in the year, we're going to be having William Darity with us talking about the topic of reparations. And so they have a book out, From Here to Equality, him and Kirsten Mullen, but there's a new one coming out soon. So we may be picking that up over the summer, but I want to cue that for you right now. If there's nothing else, thank y'all again for joining us. Again, Professor Gordon-Nembhard, you've been soul stirring and looking forward to the work. Y'all have a great weekend and looking forward to y'all for the next book talk. And I'm inviting some of y'all into a space to design our way forward. So be looking for the tap on the shoulder. All right, y'all. Thanks a lot.
Have a great weekend. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
See y'all.